Hello, everyone. This is Colin Cox, and for this week, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. Certainly, a few of the stories. I won't have time to discuss all of them, and I also want to discuss Rite of Passage as an idea and a theme that often appears in not just literature, but also film and television. It's actually quite popular. So before I talk about the stories that I asked you to read for this week, let's start with Rite of Passage. And there are, I suspect, an endless number of ways to define this concept, but the way that I like to think about it and the way that I like to talk about it is to imagine that a rite of passage is something that a culture or a community, and it's often tied to notions of tradition. It's the sort of thing that a culture or a community or a people think or assume that everyone just needs to experience. So, and again, thinking about it in terms of culture, tradition, should encourage you to think that not every culture, not every country, for example, will have the same rites of passage. Some will be different than others, they will look different, etc. But if we're just thinking of contemporary American culture, some people might argue that a rite of passage is graduating high school, right? Think about how many movies and how many shows, how many stories and how many books dramatize that time in our lives. And one of the reasons why, again, because this is a moment that's often repeated and recycled. It's something that a lot of people, or practically everyone, experiences in some way. And even thinking about it in those terms, it's still a bit complicated because not everyone graduates from high school in the same way. It might look different for some of us. So often, the rite of passage, or a particular rite of passage, while it could in theory have this sort of universalizing applicability, it can also be quite limiting in some ways because it has the effect, or at least it suggests that, well, all experiences of, for example, graduating high school look like this, or they should look like this. And I think we are constantly interrogating and constantly challenging rites of passage. This is one of the reasons why extremely popular rites of passage, whether it's, again, if we're thinking of just a contemporary American context, graduating from high school or maybe college, it's why we're often telling stories about these moments because we're constantly attempting to reconfigure what they look like. We're constantly asking ourselves, does this look the way we think it should look? What sorts of changes do we need to make? What sorts of antiquated notions should we discontinue or disabuse ourselves of? Another interesting rite of passage is, for, again, this is not something that everyone experiences, but if you just look at all of the popular media and popular narratives about romantic love, some people might argue that falling in love is a rite of passage. The romantic comedy genre is one that is just inundated with entry after entry from year to year. Again, whether it's film or television, narratives, stories, novels, plays, etc. So, in the simplest terms, rite of passage is, or a rite of passage, because there might be more, or let me try again, there are certainly multiple rites of passage. It's simply something that a culture or a tradition, and again, it's often tethered to notions of tradition. It's something that a culture or a people, a community, etc., assumes that all of us should experience, or it's something that is so beneficial. It has certain beneficial qualities and characteristics that it's something that all of us should experience. And the two stories that I want to talk about today, Boys and Girls by Alice Munro and A&P by John Updike, they both engage certain rites of passage that many of us grapple with today. So with that said, I want to start with Boys and Girls by Alice Munro. And I think what we see in this story is, if we're thinking first, let's just identify the rite of passage. What we see in this story is the way all of us are brought into certain gendered identities. And here again, I think we certainly see, I was speaking before about how often rites of passage are traditional, or they're tethered to notions of tradition. Maybe there's something quite conservative about them. And I think we see that in this story in particular, because the way Monroe crafts or dramatizes the rite of passage in Boys and Girls, again, it's thinking about how all of us are gendered in particular traditional ways, and the sorts of assumptions, the sorts of behaviors that are appropriate for boys and girls, or men and women. And I think space, I'll talk a lot about space with this story, because I think Monroe, she's quite savvy in this way. She also associates these gendered identities, or these gendered categories, with particular spaces in ways that, again, probably feel quite traditional to us. But let's say a couple of things about just the mechanics of this story. So this is a first-person narrative, and again, think back to what I said a few weeks ago. Because it is a first-person narrative, it is potentially quite limiting. We don't have this omniscient third-person perspective. But I think Monroe makes this choice for a couple of important reasons. And one of the most important reasons, the revelation at the end of the story, when our narrator, who remains unnamed, and I'll talk about why that's important in just a moment, this revelation when her father says, "She's just a girl," or "You're just a girl," I think if this were not a limited first-person narrative, we as the reader would probably know that much sooner. And I think part of what's so interesting about the story is how the narrator almost wants to maintain or sustain this perhaps tension, or once we arrive at the end of the story, this foolish assumption that her father has as much affection for her as he does for her younger brother, Laird. And it's quite clear that one of the reasons why he doesn't have that kind of affection, one of the reasons why he uses her as a worker, it's not because he's a feminist or anything. It's because he didn't necessarily have a choice. He used her out of necessity, not out of choice or preference. But again, thinking about the mechanics of the story, I don't think that sense of tension would necessarily exist if this were not a limited first-person narrative. So I think here what we're seeing is how first-person narratives, which are often quite limited because we're seeing a story from a particular character's perspective, I think we're seeing how keeping information from a reader has certain dramatic effects. And again, I think you can tell me what you think, rather satisfying dramatic effects, because I think that line at the end, it really hits us hard. It's the intention, I suppose, is that it hits us much like it hit her. It's something of a revelation, because it seems to contradict all of the work that the narrator does throughout the story to suggest that, well, again, even if she nor her father would use language like feminist, he's still someone who at least she wants to maintain or sustain this notion that he is maybe a bit progressive in that way. He sees his daughter as someone who is capable in ways that traditional gender roles don't often think of young girls as capable, or don't often think of women as capable. So again, I think having that limited perspective, keeping that information from us, has a series of interesting consequences. But what I also think is interesting about the story is how this narrator refuses to, or simply elects not to, disclose her name. And I think if we wanted to offer a couple of explanations why, I think we probably need to think about Monroe, the author, for just a moment. And we maybe need to ask ourselves, why would the author elect not to have the narrator disclose her name or identify herself with a particular name? She really just exists as this girl or as the girl. And I think this is one of the moments where Monroe, and if you have any familiarity with her work, she is an exceptional short story writer. She's an exceptional Canadian short story writer in particular. She writes a lot about Canada, and I think you have a sense of just how talented she is because of how she's able to describe these natural environments. But I think ultimately what Monroe wants to do here is to suggest that this girl's experience, even though the particulars might be different for different people, there's something quite universal about this revelation, or there's something quite universal about this realization that, regrettably, her father, perhaps, and I think this is perhaps one way to read the text, her father, like most men or all men, just don't take her or don't take girls and women that seriously. Now, you can disagree, obviously, with that reading, but I think that's one possible way to read it. And if we wanted to extend this analysis a little bit, we could also perhaps argue, or we might suspect, that part of what Monroe wants to do here is to allow us as readers to insert ourselves into the place or the space that the narrator creates. This is something that I always encourage students to pay attention to. Anytime a character in a story, and in particular, anytime a narrator remains unnamed, what are we as readers meant to do with that gap in knowledge, that ontological gap? It's information we don't necessarily have. What are we to do with it? And I think one possible reason why writers do this is because it's quite easy then for readers to insert themselves into whatever situation the writer in question attempts to dramatize, describe, etc. So now let's transition to the particulars of the text itself. And I think I want to start with just the way Monroe describes natural environments and spaces in this story, because I think it's quite interesting, because I think one of the things we see is this stark contrast between exterior and interior. And we could even go as far, and I would encourage us to do so, to imagine that these spaces are gendered in particular ways. So I think we're perhaps seeing, or what Monroe ultimately wants us to see, is how it's not just that we as individuals are gendered, but even inanimate objects, spaces that we occupy, they're gendered too. And what we see in the story is this difference between the home or the domestic, which, according to Monroe's narrator, is a deeply feminine space. And for this narrator, it's deeply repressive and oppressive. And by contrast, we have this natural environment, which for most of the story, it's a space occupied by men. This is a masculine space. And for our narrator, for most of the story, there's something quite liberating about this space. It's open, and again, you can just pay attention to the language she uses when she describes these two spaces. There's something quite stifling about the kitchen, for example. And again, just thinking about how kitchens are gendered, or how we have gendered kitchens in particular ways, but the natural environment outside the home doesn't feel this way. Yes, there is a kind of brutality to this natural world because we see a lot of death, we see a lot of blood and a lot of viscera, but I think for our narrator, especially by contrast to how stifling domestic indoor spaces are, even though there is this brutality, it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that she's necessarily averse to. Again, the exterior, those spaces outside of the domestic, those are the spaces of liberation for her. And again, in this story, Monroe genders it in a particular way. And I think maybe a good place to start is just with the beginning of the story. I'll read the introduction. So follow along with me. This is on page 153. My father was a fox farmer. That is, he raised silver foxes in pens. And in the fall and early winter, when their fur was prime, he killed them and skinned them and sold their pelts to the Hudson's Bay Company or the Montreal Fur Traders. These companies supplied us with heroic calendars to hang, one on each side of the kitchen door, against a background of cold blue sky and black pine forests and treacherous northern rivers. Plumed adventurers planted the flags of England or of France. Magnificent savages bent their backs to the portage. So here with this introduction, again, just pay attention to the amount of detail. There's I would argue, at least not just here, but throughout the story, a fair amount of detail and affection for these natural environments. But I think we're getting a lot of information here, even if it's communicated in something of a subtle and concise way. I think, and all of this perhaps functions as a bit of foreshadowing. This notion that her father is a fox farmer, that he keeps foxes in pens. I think this is extremely important because we know later in the story, when he attempts to kill Flora, the horse that our narrator releases or allows to run off, just this imagery of cages and barriers. It's a motif that Monroe recycles throughout this story, and you could almost imagine that for this narrator there is a similar sense or there's something about this sense of confinement that seems to define her existence, or it's something that she feels is quite imminent. Again, when thinking about domestic spaces as quite restricting, there is this sense that everything in this world is just penned or hemmed in. And for our narrator, she's often looking for those spaces where she can break through. But I think there's an interesting bit of foreshadowing happening here with the father. One of the first things we learn about him is that he's a farmer who keeps animals in pens. And you can almost imagine that, once again, when you reach the end of the story, our narrator feels a similar sort of way. And it's not just that he keeps animals in pens, he really seems to harvest them only to then dispose of them once they are no longer useful. Again, just imagining the sense of foreshadowing once we arrive at the end of the story and how the narrator probably feels something quite similar. So from here, maybe we can say a little more about this father figure and who he is, because I want to talk about the individual characters in this story, the sorts of ideas that they represent, and what's really quite unique about this father, or maybe it's not unique, but this narrator has a remarkable amount of affection for someone who doesn't seem to communicate a lot. And this is something we learn, for example, that the only time, this is something the narrator discloses, the only time her father would really communicate with her was when they were working together. So again, perhaps this narrator should have realized what he says at the end isn't necessarily that surprising, or it should not have been that surprising. But what I also think is interesting about him are these little bits of details we get about him. Look, for example, on pages 154 and 155. And I'll read a fair bit here because I think it's important. So, bottom of page 154. Alive, the foxes inhabited a world my father made for them. It was surrounded by a high guard fence, like a medieval town, with a gate that was padlocked at night. Along the streets of this town were ranged large, sturdy pens. Each of them had a real door that a man could go through, a wooden ramp along the wire for the foxes to run up and down, and a kennel, something like a clothes chest with air holes, where they slept and stayed in winter and had their young. There were feeding and watering dishes attached to the wire in such a way that they could be emptied and cleaned from the outside. The dishes were made of old tin cans, and the ramps and kennels of odds and ends of old lumber. Everything was tidy and ingenious. My father was tirelessly inventive, and his favorite book in the world was Robinson Crusoe. He had fitted a tin drum on a wheelbarrow for bringing water down to the pens. This was my job in summer when the foxes had to have water twice a day, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, and again after supper. I filled the drum at the pump and trundled it down through the barnyard to the pens, where I parked it and filled my watering can and went along the streets. Laird came too, with his little cream and green gardening can filled too full and knocking against his legs and slopping water on his canvas shoes. I had the real watering can, my father's, though I could only carry it 3/4 full. So I think we're getting a lot of interesting information here. Again, Monroe reinforces how confining this environment is, even though, again, by comparison, for most of the story, that which is outside of the house, that which is outside of the home, that which is outside of the kitchen feels far freer. There is perhaps this bit of irony where it's still a confining space, and you could almost imagine this is Monroe offering a bit of commentary on how traditional gender roles work. This is something, if you are familiar at all with a figure like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice who recently died, before she became a member of the Supreme Court, many of the cases that she tried in front of the Supreme Court, she ostensibly argued that traditional gender roles and laws meant to reinforce traditional gender roles were not just oppressive for women, but they were oppressive for men as well. The sense of limitation cut both ways. And I think you can almost imagine that Monroe's making a similar sort of commentary here, that the sense of confinement, it doesn't move in one direction. It cuts both ways. But I think what's most important is this father, this patriarchal figure. He's the one who's really in a position of control or power. And even this small detail about how his favorite book is Robinson Crusoe, I think there's multiple ways of reading this. Obviously, if you read the footnote at the bottom of the page, Robinson Crusoe, it's this interesting story written by, or this interesting novel that Daniel Defoe wrote, I believe in the 18th century, about a man who remains perhaps marooned on this island alone for a long period of time. It's like Gilligan's Island, just without the hijinks. But he makes all of these with limited resources. He makes all of these interesting and inventive tools and devices that allow him to live and survive. There was a Tom Hanks film maybe about 15 or 20 years ago called Castaway that feels like something of a modern adaptation of Robinson Crusoe. But what I also think is interesting about this reference, and this is perhaps the part of the reference that remains unsaid, or it's something the narrator doesn't fully realize or even reckon with, is how Robinson Crusoe as a character is something of a deeply isolated figure, and I don't necessarily know what any of you would want to do with that, but I think that's an interesting reference, because I think her father feels equally isolated, equally inaccessible in the same way that Robinson Crusoe is literally inaccessible for most of that novel. So I would encourage you, pay attention to those kinds of references too, but there's a little more happening here that I want to talk about. First, notice how our narrator describes, characterizes, and frames Laird, and I'll talk about how we're meant to think about him at the end of the story, but here he seems quite juvenile, quite incapable. Notice he seems to have this toy watering can. So he's almost playing being their father's helper. And again, I think this is an interesting bit of foreshadowing, because I think it's meant to suggest that his place, even though he is quite incapable of doing that now, this is eventually the spot, or this is the role that he will assume and that he will occupy. So playing at it, while that might seem perhaps inconsequential, I think it obviously isn't, because you could imagine that even with his toys, his father, he's grooming him for this. And our narrator, she almost wants to take a bit of pride in the idea that she's the one carrying the water, but I do think it's important that she can only carry it at 3/4 full. So again, I think here, isolated in this moment, we're almost meant to imagine that this is a source of pride for our narrator. But once we arrive at the end of the story and allow what the father says at the end to cascade back across the story, I think this is just another one of those subtle moments where, yes, she's helping him, but it's not because he necessarily wants her help. It's a necessity, and it's as if he lives with her inability, I think is maybe the language he would use, her inability to do the job correctly or to do the job fully, even as he perhaps leads her to think that she is capable of doing this work. And I think what is quite fascinating is she is capable of doing this work, but because she's not the boy, she's not allowed to do this work. So I think there's a difference between ability, capability, and permission. And there seems to be something of a contradiction happening there. But I said I wanted to say a little something about Laird, because I think what's important about Laird, this is also a story, this is not just a story about this narrator realizing regrettably, her place in the world, and perhaps the limited options available to her, or what she might need to do to create more options and opportunities for herself. But it's also a story about how Laird's getting perhaps inaugurated into this kind of gendered identity, or into a kind of gender identity, because there's this moment, and I'll go just straight to the end of the story. There's this moment near the end when, and again, hopefully you've read the story, but I'll talk about Flora the horse in a few moments, but eventually they catch Flora, and we don't see this happen because the narrator doesn't see this happen, but in addition to catching Flora, they also kill Flora. And this is a moment on page 162, and this is what Monroe writes. My mother had to heat dinner up all over again. Harry and my father had changed from their bloody overalls into ordinary working overalls in the barn, and they washed their arms and necks and faces at the sink and splashed water on their hair and combed it. Laird lifted his arm to show off a streak of blood. We shot old Flora, he said, and cut her up in 50 pieces. So I think what's important about this moment, in particular, the idea that he shows this blood on his arm, it's as if he's been baptized into something, because if you remember, I talked about the introduction. I always like to focus on introductions. It's an introduction with a lot of information, but one of the most important pieces of information we learn at the beginning is that The world of our narrator's father is one in many ways defined by violence, by blood, and by death. And you could argue that some of it's necessary, of course. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But this idea, in particular, blood, right? The blood of an animal that you kill. And how for Laird, it's as if this blood on his arm quite literally marks something for him. So this is also a story about his rite of passage too. And I think this is something that it's easy for all of us to miss, because this very much seems to be a story about our narrator. And it is. I wouldn't suggest otherwise. But I think that's what's so wonderful about what Munro does here in the background, something quite subtle. It's happening too, and it's not just our narrator experiencing a rite of passage, but Laird does as well. And I think we again see that, and again, even just thinking about this as a perverse kind of baptism, right? He's been baptized in the blood that is perhaps this definition of masculinity as embodied by his father. So with that said, why don't we spend a bit of time talking about the mother? And what I think is interesting about the mother is how there are these subtle moments when our narrator seems to see or understand, or if we also wanted to imagine, reflects back. Because there's also this sense that what's happening in the story, this is something the narrator tells us upon reflection. It's not happening in the moment. And I think there are these subtle moments when our narrator interjects these bits of reflection that, more than anything, cast the mother in, at times, something of a frustrating light. But I think at other times, our narrator wants us to understand that she spent a lot of time thinking about what her mother's life must have been like. And there's a kind of grace in that description too. So where I want to start reading, it's actually near the bottom of the page on 156. My mother, I felt, was not to be trusted. She was kinder than my father and more easily fooled, but you could not depend on her, and the real reasons for the things she said and did were not to be known. She loved me, and she sat up late at night making a dress of the difficult style I wanted for me to wear when school started, but she was also my enemy. She was always plotting. She was plotting now to get me to stay in the house more, although she knew I hated it, because she knew I hated it, and kept me from working for my father. It seemed to me she would do this simply out of perversity and to try her power. It did not occur to me that she could be lonely or jealous. No grown-up could be. They were too fortunate. I sat and kicked my heels monotonously against a feed bag, raising dust, and did not come out until she was gone. So a couple of things here that I think are interesting. One, this idea that her mother is her enemy, and pay attention to how this narrator thinks about perhaps why her mother is her enemy. And it's because she, at least by her estimation, our narrator, her mother tried to restrict and restrain her. And she tried to keep her in the house, right? So I think one of the ways perhaps our narrator wants to read this is okay, so it's not necessarily society that tells me that I need to, as a girl, as a woman, be indoors, occupy my time with domestic activities. It's this woman, it's my mother, right? But I think this small little confession, when she says, it seemed to me that she would do this simply out of perversity and to try her power, it did not occur to me that she could be lonely or jealous. This is an extremely important confession, in particular the part about her being lonely, because I think it speaks to something that, in particular, many women have written about before, how occupying a traditional gender role, remaining at home, which is not necessarily something that happens today, at least not as often in the way that perhaps Monroe thinks about it in this story or the way that it's dramatized in this story. But many women have written about and have spoken about how lonely and isolating it is, how alone they are. And you could almost imagine that her will and her desire to keep her daughter indoors, perhaps it was this need or in reaction to this need to have perhaps connection, companionship, etc. But I think another possible way to read it, especially when we think about the end, there's something so important about the end of the story and how it has this cascading effect across the story we just read. It's entirely possible that her mother was attempting to protect her, not from any element outside of the house. Well, maybe her father and what her mother knew her father would do or say eventually. Perhaps you could argue that in attempting to keep her indoors, she was in many ways attempting to shield her from the inevitable pain and heartbreak and disappointment that would come when her father inevitably rejected her and elevated Laird over her. And I think that has the effect of a couple of things, or it does a couple of interesting things. I think first, again, it shows the limitations of first-person narratives, but when I say limitations, I don't mean narrative limitations. I mean, I think it shows what's so interesting about the limitations of first person, that as our narrator describes it, her mother's something of a tyrant. But what she doesn't know is what's motivating her mother. And I think especially once we arrive at the end of the story, we as readers, especially as critical readers who are paying attention to the text, we could potentially deduce that, well, this was actually an attempt to protect her, to save her from this inevitable disappointment that perhaps her mother knew was coming, because maybe it's not necessarily something that she had experienced, but it's something she knew. It's something she understood. The world, the expectations, her husband, etc. So that's something that I like about this moment. But what I also like about it is how our narrator seems to completely ignore this little detail about the dress, right? Just how much work her mother would do, how much work she did, and the work she tried to do to potentially make her daughter happy, to make her daughter feel accepted, like she has a place in the world. And what I think is so fascinating about this story, and I think it's crystallized in this moment, is how this is potentially something that our narrator will never fully understand. And this is a story, I said this a moment ago about Laird, that what's happening with Laird is something we may unintentionally ignore because we are focused so intently on the narrator. I think a similar sort of thing happens here, that what Monroe also wants to do with this story is dramatize the gaps in understanding, or the distance that exists between mothers and daughters, fathers and daughters, or perhaps just at large, children and parents. And in particular, the gaps in knowledge, that if they were full, or if they were filled, would potentially allow children to better understand why their parents made the choices they made. And it might allow parents to better understand why children made the choices they made. Because I think what Monroe dramatizes quite nicely in this story is how children and parents are often talking maybe over one another, or they're not actually talking at all. There's a fair amount of interaction without a lot of communication. And I think she's quite good at dramatizing those dynamics. Again, with someone like Monroe, and I think all great writers are like this, we as readers are encouraged to pay close attention to those moments where perhaps a narrator or a character doesn't know something, because I think good writers give us enough information to fill those gaps for our narrators and for our characters, especially the ones that we really like, the ones we have affection for. And part of the reason why I have so much affection for this narrator is because there's just so much she doesn't know. And that is something, again, deeply human. I think there's something about her not knowing, her thinking she knows, but ultimately not knowing. Again, I think we as readers probably have a better understanding of the dynamics of this family than she does. So in that way, you can see Monroe deploying something called dramatic irony, where we as the audience know more than a character or the characters in the story. And so with that said, I think I want to finish talking about this story by talking about this moment near the end when our narrator, again, maybe you would argue she releases Flora or simply chooses or elects not to restrain and constrain her. So this is on page 161, and I want to read just two parts of two different paragraphs, and then I'll say something about it. Instead of shutting the gate, I opened it as wide as I could. I did not make any decision to do this. It was just what I did. Flora never slowed down. She galloped straight past me, and Lair jumped up and down, yelling, shut it," even after it was too late. My father and Henry appeared in the field a moment too late to see what I had done. They only saw Flora heading for the township road. They would think I had not got there in time. Flora would not really get away. And now here I'm just a couple of paragraphs down. They would catch up with her in the truck. Or if they did not catch her this morning, somebody would see her and telephone us this afternoon or tomorrow. There was no wild country here for her to run to, only farms. What was more, my father had paid for her. We needed the meat to feed the foxes. We needed the foxes to make our living. All I had done was make more work for my father, who worked hard enough already. And when my father found out about it, he was not going to trust me anymore. He would know that I was not entirely on his side. I was on Flora's side, and that made me no use to anybody, not even to her. Just the same, I did not regret it. When she came running at me and I held the gate open, that was the only thing I could do. So there's a couple of interesting things happening here. I think you could certainly argue this is the most significant moment of the story, because this is the moment when our narrator, despite knowing and understanding the consequences, makes something of a radical choice or a radical decision. But what's doubly interesting about it is how she makes the choice knowing that it is functionally meaningless. And that is to say, she acknowledges as much that this won't change anything that happens to or with Flora. And I think it's interesting how she again makes this reference to physical and natural spaces. She says it's not like there's this wild open space outside of our farm, it's just more farms. And you can almost imagine within the confines of this story, farm is a word that's almost synonymous with constraint or restraint. And we talked about how, again, these physical spaces within the story are gendered in particular ways. And in this way, you could almost imagine that what she's envisioning, what she would hope or want for Flora, would almost be perhaps a space beyond these sorts of gendered expectations. But as she sees it, it just doesn't exist in her world, which you could imagine for maybe someone like Monroe, it's something of a metaphor or a symbol for how it doesn't exist in the world. Or maybe if we wanted to be more precise and apply it to today, there are inherent limitations, and regrettably, that's just the way things are until we decide to change it, if we ever decide to change it. So what I like about it, though, and this is something that I talk to my students about a lot, is we often make these calculations that something is only worth doing unless we know there's at least a chance of a positive outcome. And it is often thought of as quite foolish to do something if you know that the thing you are about to do or the thing you consider doing has no chance of success. But I think there's something potentially radical about deciding to act even if you have this sense, or even if you know that, well, maybe it won't work out, or there's no chance for it to work out. Because I think at that point, you're almost in this space beyond the sorts of tight calculations that we all often make. Because I think what ultimately happens here for this character, even though it's not something she fully understands or realizes until the end, is by doing what she does, she's ultimately breaking from her father. And you could even argue, without realizing it, she's breaking from her father before he has a chance to break from her, or before he has a chance to articulate his intentions to break from her. So I think in that way, even though what he says is extremely hurtful and disappointing, you can almost imagine that in this space, in this moment where she says, I know this won't work, something quite wonderful emerges out of it. And you could argue perhaps it's this kind of agency that she's able to perhaps grasp or possess or have. It's this moment of breaking from her father, and perhaps, and we don't know this because the story ends before we could know this, perhaps breaking from some of the ideas that not only define his life, the sorts of limited ideas that define his life, but those limitations really cascade across this whole family. So that's maybe one way to think about it. I would love to know what you think about this moment, why it's potentially important. I also think it's interesting that as she tells it, she seems to think that she's not really making a decision. It's almost meant to feel impulsive, right? Like she's not making a decision. It's like something else was acting through her, or something else possessed her. Maybe even a word like possessed is really good to think about how she wants to think about why she made the decision she made. But again, Flora, she's not wrong. Flora dies. I talked about that earlier, and no, I think actually that's because of time constraints. I think that's where I want to stop. I know there's 2 additional stories that I asked you to read for this week, but I, as always, want to keep these audio lectures around an hour, and we are getting close to that 50-minute mark. So I think that's where I want to stop for today. Just to remind you again, one of the big themes for this week is Rite of Passage. I talked about that at the beginning. One of the best ways to think about the Rite of Passage, or to think about a Rite of Passage, is to imagine that it's something that a culture or a community, a country, a state, maybe even a family, etc., thinks it's something, an experience, a moment that needs to happen in someone's life. And I talked about how a lot of stories, a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows dramatize rites of passage. Again, think about how many TV shows, how many movies, how many books are about people being in high school or people being in college. How many romantic comedy films are there that dramatize that feeling of falling in love, finding your person, yada, yada, yada. So rites of passage, it's really quite fascinating how, along with a myriad of other things, seems to tether society together. But what I like about this story, and what I like about a lot of interesting stories that grapple with rite of passage, or that grapple with rites of passage, is how, well, we need to think of ways of challenging them. Sure, we can dramatize it, but let's dramatize it while challenging it. And I think that's certainly something that we see in Monroe's Boys and Girls, and it's certainly something we see in a lot of other stories and narratives that use different rites of passage as something of a central thematic conceit for that story. So, okay, with all of that said, this is Colin Cox for English 1020. I hope you have a wonderful week. Please contact me if you have any questions.